Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ventures Podcast. I'm excited about today's episode with Daneil Wilson. He has a PhD in linguistics. And in this episode, we talk about why the development of human language technology to save thousands of languages from going extinct around the world is important. He works with a group called ILAD, International Literacy and Development, and they are all about promoting human flourishing by providing local solutions to local problems. And so in this episode, we dive into kind of why Daneil got into this space, educating us about how linguistics is approached into the international world, how language development and literacy can be used to practically help humans flourish, and why this matters for the future of our world. We also talk a little bit and kind of tee up Web3 and why that matters in the world that Daneil's working in. And this is actually a part one of a two-part series where next time we're actually going to dive much more specifically into Web3, but this is really meant to educate us, the viewers and listeners, about what international literacy and development does, why the specific focus on human language technology is important, and I couldn't be more delighted to share this episode with you. So, if you are listening, you can also watch by visiting wclittle.com, and there you'll see more extensive show notes to the things that we talk about today. And if you're watching, you can also listen anywhere that you get your podcasts. You can just search for Ventures. So with that, please enjoy this conversation with Daneil Wilson. All right, Daneil, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Will. Glad to be here.
So this podcast, we talk a lot about venture building, venture investing from both a for-profit and a nonprofit perspective, because the process of building ventures comes around usually how to solve problems, right? And getting to know you has made me realize there's more problems going on around the world than any of us understand. But the problem space that you and ILAD specifically are tackling is it's hard to overstate how important it is. So would you mind just teeing us up, tell us a little bit about your background and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I could sum it up under sort of a two-word descriptor, because I do a lot of things, but I could describe it as compassionate innovation. So basically, I founded a company consultancy called XRI. It's devoted to paying attention to what's happening in technology, innovation, academia, and then asking myself this question: how do we get these best ideas, like these really good ideas, to the rest of humanity? You know, how do we leverage this tech, these amazing innovations, these really good ideas, and keep in mind the people that are often overlooked in the history of technology and innovation? And so that's kind of, I can sum up, what I do most of my time in multiple different spheres like that. And so I work in academia. Obviously, I've got this consultancy. I'm working in Web3, and I'm basically trying to use all of that towards this goal.
So let's talk a little bit about ILAD. What is ILAD, and why are you involved with it?
Yeah, so ILAD stands for International Literacy and Development, and it's a nonprofit that is, it specifically keeps in mind these often overlooked people around the world, and has 4 core competencies that they sort of leverage to provide local solutions to local problems, is how we describe it. Not like global solutions to local problems or our solutions to local problems, but local solutions to local problems, leveraging local talent and innovation. So the 4 core competencies are literacy, agribusiness, business development centers, which are like incubators for local entrepreneurs, and then a human language technology. And so I'm in charge of everything happening in the human language technology space.
So let's talk a little bit about your background coming into this. You have a doctorate in linguistics. What got you into that whole field?
Okay, yeah. So I was sort of obsessively interested in language, and pushed into that space pretty heavy into actual theoretical linguistics. So I was curious about how language works in the mind. I got kind of really deep on some critical debates on certain aspects of language. And then I wrapped up my PhD, and I applied for my first postdoc, didn't get it. And I know that's very typical.
Mm.
I saw a lot of my friends who are finishing their doctorates, and they're just going from one postdoc to another, which hardly pays, and really just trying to get into a professorship somewhere. Tenure was almost laughable at this point, of getting tenure. And I found this opportunity to sort of like use what I learned about language in a way that I could, that would be much more exciting for me. I mean, I'm still involved in publishing. I'm still involved in academia in that space doing research, but I really love kind of how it's prepared me for what I do with this language technology piece. And so I decided just to forget chasing that and jump into nonprofit and even for-profit spaces. So.
Mm. Mm. So let's talk about linguistics for a little bit. For those that aren't familiar, what is it? What is the study? Like how many different languages are out there? Like give us a sort of a general overview, Professor. Give us a little training lesson on what is linguistics. Why are you so excited about it?
Yeah.
Teach us a little bit here.
Okay, well, so linguistics, broadly speaking, is the study of language, right? But there's just dozens of subfields in linguistics, because you can go a lot of different directions with it, right? So you can focus on the social component, right? Sociolinguistics within a community, and how we associate different statuses with different like features of language, and how communication works and this kinds of stuff. And then you can get into psycholinguistics. You can get into corpus linguistics, which is just let's restrict ourselves to just a corpus, and find interesting things about a particular language from that. We can get into historical linguistics, how language has changed over time. And then there's theoretical linguistics, which I've been involved in, about how language works in the mind, and can we actually find out things about languages universally, something true about all languages. And then you get into computational linguistics. So, what you can do with languages and computers together. And so there's just a lot of cool subdisciplines that are all interesting in their own right.
So not including dialects,
Yeah.
or though maybe even help me understand how to even ask this question, but how many languages are out there?
So the standard answer is 7,000, but I think a lot of us working in the space know that there's quite a bit more. There's a lot more than that. But sort of the standard answer is 7,000 for languages.
And how, clue us into a little bit of the debate. How do you define what a language is, and what's a dialect, or like how does that generally go down?
Well, there's a joke that the difference between a language and a dialect is an army and a navy. So if you have an army and a navy, then you've got a language. If you don't, you have a dialect. But it's not quite true. I mean, that's the joke that we all throw around. But they have, there are different tests, right? In terms of you collect a certain number of words in, two different languages, and if they have this percentage of overlap or some degree of overlap that are correlated with, the percentage, then you could safely say that this is a language, right? If it differs based on these standard scales, based on a certain percentage, then it should be considered its own language. But I mean, the folks doing field linguistics and documentation linguistics know that this is a very gray space. So it's really hard to define.
Got it. Okay. So what's fascinating about some of our earlier conversations, not on recorded here, is that there are many of these languages are spoken by less than 100 people, or at least some of them are, and some of them, they're going extinct. And often the people who speak these languages are extremely under-resourced. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like where in the world, how many, what kind of numbers are we talking about? What's the life situation for these types of people? Just paint us a picture a little bit on what's going on out there.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've got So you've got the majority of languages being unwritten. Many language, so that makes them like primarily oral based, right? And then you have, but those people might be literate in a majority language, for instance. You know, they will have adopted a language of wider communication, a lingua franca in their region, with which they can read and write and sort of interact. But then there are some languages that we would say, some populations of people that are pre-literate, that are they aren't literate in any language whatsoever, and those are just extremely challenging situations. Those are often the people that are greatly overlooked. And I mean, if you can imagine just not having any means of reading or writing any language on planet Earth, how much you're left out of in terms of opportunity and possibility. But I mean, so it's just a side effect of globalization. Like one of the guys, a guy that I've worked with who speaks one of the languages I work with, which has about 20,000 speakers. I asked him if he was interested in working with me to build some technology for his language, and asked him about like what like getting like just entertainment content, media in his language, for his kids and stuff, to help them maintain their language. He said, I would absolutely love to. Like, I'm so glad that you're doing this. He said, but the reality is I work 12 hours a day stocking shelves. And I have no time to work with you on this. And he said, and to be perfectly honest, my kids, I want them to get better at the majority language, because that's going to get them through school and get them a job. Right. And so many of these languages are faced with a decision. They have to make a decision between, do I pick, my child's future, my child's economic future, educational future and opportunity, or preserving my language and culture. And unfortunately, nobody should be faced with that decision. Because I get this a lot. Like, some people have said, why not just let the language die? I mean, that's just how things work, right? Well, first of all, that's our right to say that, because it's not our language that's threatened. But second of all, there's a quote I like to use that I don't remember where it came from, but basically, anytime a language dies, it's like someone dropped a bomb on the Louvre, right? Because that entire community's history, language, songs, folklore, crafts, jokes, memories are gone. They're gone for all of humanity. And so it's it's a lot harder to swallow when you're confronted with that way. So that's what we're facing. And I think I might get this stat wrong, but I think I heard recently it's like once every 14 days another language dies. Something like that. And they're estimating dire statistics at how many languages will be lost by the end of this millennium, or the end of the century.
I mean, that's sad for all kinds of reasons, right? I mean, just
right.
Yeah, there's so much that we as humans have to offer each other, whether you're in a large language community or not. And that richness, like, I know I and others and those that listen to this podcast have a desire to experience as much of that richness as possible.
Yeah.
And what I'm convicted about by some of our conversations recently is that the last couple of years, especially the last 6 months or so, we've been talking a lot about Web3 on this podcast, a lot about DAOs and NFTs and DeFi and metaverses, et cetera, et cetera. And it's tempting as Western people to think about banking the unbanked, which is important, of course, right? But I think I have fallen victim to just thinking like, okay, if we could just figure out how to get devices so that they can have payments and then they can interact with the global economy, that would be really, really important. And it is, but there's an even more fundamental step, which is literacy, which is, like you said, is there a way that these people can even talk and communicate and write to participate in that global economy, that getting them a device to be able to hook up to internet and do payments and entrepreneurship, that's later down the journey, right? There are a non-trivial number of human beings out there that cannot read or write and aren't exposed to a a language that then is interoperable with say sort of global commerce. Do you have an idea of how many, I know I'm putting you on the spot a lot of these facts and figures, but do you have any idea of about how many of those people are in that category, sort of low resourced, not really plugged into the global information flow?
So I will give you one stat that's illustrative. I think that just based on research that I did not too long ago, we were looking at the literacy rates among different speakers of dialects of Arabic, and we were comparing those sort of like, because in Arabic it's a complicated situation because you have standard Arabic, which is where most of the Arab speaking world, like, they read and write and should read and write in standard Arabic. But then the dialects are I mean, there's lots of different dialects of Arabic that have a non-trivial difference with standard Arabic. And so what's happening is they go to school, and not only are they learning to read, but they're also learning to read a language they don't speak, right? And so those two factors end up leading to a sub 50% literacy rate among speakers of different dialects of Arabic. And that's not a small amount of people, right? So these are people that are growing up not able to read. They end up not being able to read because of these different factors. And so yes, you're right. Like I'm deep down the Web3 rabbit hole, and I'm realizing for the first time anyone with an internet connection can finally tap into creating sustainable income for their families and their communities through any stranger on the internet. Like, this is cool. Like, we're here.
Yeah.
But that is only if the language you speak the best is online, right? If you're able to use the language that you speak the best online. And so that's what we're doing, is we're trying to build the tools necessary to make languages digitally viable so that they can tap into these types of things. So yeah, it takes a couple of different innovations working simultaneously to make sure everybody gets to enjoy this space and flourish.
That's a perfect segue into my next question. So we could talk a ton about Web3. We could talk a ton about ILAD and international literacy and development. We could talk a lot about the different sort of academic things that you're up to, and let's do that in future episodes. I really just want to, right now, I want to drill in on human language technology. What are you working on to advance the helping humans flourish via human language technology and computing, so that more people don't have to allow their language to go extinct and can participate in this global information? Maybe we can talk about Web3 at the end here, but I'd like to take some time to really drill in and nerd out a little bit for the venture builders and venture investors and others that are listening to this, to get a better understanding of what's the cutting edge. What are you working on in human language technology?
Sure. All right. So you've got a couple of sort of general tools that will make a language viable, right? So you'll need like your basic machine translation system, right, to go from one language, communicate between languages. It's the button that we all click on those websites, whatever, translate this page into English type thing that we just take for granted, or go to Google Translate, copy and paste and see what happens, right? It's those types of engines that most languages don't have, right? And so most of the really good content that is online, they can't access because it's not available. There's no engine that can translate it into their language. So we build those. We build machine translation systems for low resource languages specifically, because there's a lot more attention given to medium and high resource languages, because you can let AI build the system for you, right? You can leverage all of that data, and the computer will learn how the language is structured and access the vocab, and basically they're getting very sophisticated. But the low resource languages are a challenge, which is where most languages are. Low resource languages, basically there's not enough content online or anywhere to actually train to do any machine learning at all. And so there's a couple of different approaches we've taken. One is we get experts in the language to basically take any dictionaries that exist and then take their understanding of the language and actually sit with a computational linguist, a programmer. And there are really cool systems that we've used to basically teach, one by one, how do you form a plural? How do you form the genitive? How do you do like all these different, you basically hard code the grammar of that language in a way a machine can understand. and then it links it to another language, right? That already has a system built for it, and then the two can translate between each other. And that's just to build a single pair. And so we've experimented with those systems. Our more sort of recent thing that we're doing is we're kind of got this really audacious goal where we've asked ourselves, what if we made every language medium resource? I mean, if the community is willing, and if we have the opportunity to, let them join us in this, then we, that there's technology available now where it's feasible, right? So one thing that we're developing is a data collection app where there's a sort of a gamified, incentivized crowdsourcing of language data to essentially get languages up to the medium resource status, which right now our goal is basically 500,000 sentences, parallel sentences. But the cool thing is it functions like a game, and they're just having fun, inputting their language data, and then they can get these little micropayments, right? And it's like incentivized, it's fun, they get a little cash, and we're able to build up this data set that then we can leverage the machine learning tools to actually build these language technology systems. For the oral only languages that can't like type, we're building what are called ASR, or automatic speech recognition systems. So this is basically getting lots and lots of hours of audio content, and then basically creating a speech recognition system so when they speak into their phone, which most of them have phones at this point, speak into their phone, then it will write some underlying representation of that, which isn't necessarily, the written form of that language because it doesn't exist. And then it can translate that underlying into a majority language. So they can say, help me, I think my child is sick, into their phone, and it gets translated into English on the other side. Like we're dealing with refugee populations and others who are having a hard time speaking to people around them. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do. So, and then you got the fun stuff, which is like a speech synthesis system where it's like basically a Siri in any language where it can read off text to you in any language. But I mean, that doesn't solve that doesn't solve the more urgent needs.
Wow.
And so we're just trying to make the language digitally viable and help them to flourish even in crisis moments. So
how do you define the difference between a low resource and a medium resource? So what does that even mean? What does that mean? How do you define that?
So there's debate. I think one recent article that I read, it used to be that if there's a million parallel sentences, a parallel sentence would be like, in the target language and in a majority language, like a high resource language of line of communication. There's like parallel sentences that add up to like a million. It's gone down. I think that's why we're shooting for 500,000. Is we think that 500,000 sentences, it gets us roughly in that medium resource range with which we can train and get some degree of quality out of a
interesting. Okay, so the goal would be then all the low resource ones that maybe have way less than that, get them up to 500,000 sentences that can go sort of par for par to a high resource language. How many language?
Yeah, so that once they get up to medium resource, they can actually be used to train a model to be used for a machine translation system.
How many high resource languages are out there, right? I mean, I could probably list off, I don't know, probably way less than you can list off, but how many are out there, just to get a sense of scale?
Very few. It's funny that you asked that because most of my time is spent with the low resource languages, and so like the statistics, I think for high resource there's got to be less than 200.
Okay.
It's all the big ones
that
have some viability online. That's how you get that amount of resources is all of that is available online, and you can scrape the web and
so we're talking roughly 6,800 languages that are the medium and low range. So that's kind of like what the long tail of languages would look like.
Now I'm gonna probably do a little bit more reading and redact this in the show notes after if I get some.
But we're roughly in the scale. Yeah, we'll put in the show notes. We're recording this a day earlier than it will be released, so we'll make sure to to button up our academic sides to have some accurate info in here. For sure. So then, okay, so now tell us, from an entrepreneurial and market research, market understanding lens, like where is HLT going? Like where's the future? You said everyone's going to have a Siri, and everyone might be able to participate in this crowdsourced app that could get all these languages to at least medium resource. Is that going to happen soon? Is there more tech that needs to be developed? Like, tell us a little bit about where your industry is going here.
No, I mean, I think the tech is available, especially now that we have some of this capacity for micropayments and microtransactions in bankless communities. I mean, because crypto exists, we can actually do this in a lot of places that we never could before. With something like Starlink, for instance, there's now a lot more widespread internet connectivity, or at least there will be, right? And so, I mean, the innovation is right now, like the pace of innovation is making this very feasible, in the near term. And so what it's going to take, though, is it's going to take the right people being involved, the right resources, the people that care about it, and then the people with relationships on the ground in these communities. And so, because they say that, if a language is not online, it's not going to survive. So not only are we, being part of like helping save languages, but these languages now, they won't have to choose between making a living for their families and preserving their language, because they'll be using their own language in order to make a living. Because the tech will exist, and because there'll be new opportunities.
So in terms of how to power these phones and Wi-Fi, like how many of these communities, let's say the lower resource communities, have access to electricity or power or some way of powering their devices?
I mean, an increasing amount. I heard just this last week on of just some really cool micro solar initiatives, right? Like I said, like all of the innovation is running apace right now with to provide each of these critical steps, like to get electricity, to make sure they have phone connectivity, to make sure that they can participate in a crowdsourcing app, to make sure they can get the tech for their language, to make sure they can participate in digital economies. It's all happening simultaneously. And the cool thing is, like being involved in the development world, you get to know other people in other organizations, and being involved in like the innovation world, I'm seeing these things unfold, and it just takes a conversation. When we run into a community that has that needs the language tech, like, well, I mean, the phone situation is tricky because of this and this, right? The power situation is difficult because of this and this. It just says, oh, well, I know a guy who does that, right? And so it all sort of works together. I was at a startup conference a couple months ago, just listening to somebody who gave away these who are distributing smartphones to women. Gosh, where was it? Maybe it's across Sudan. I don't remember where it was, but it was I could actually probably find the startup and send it to you. It's a really powerful story about what it means to actually, because most of the innovation being done in these communities are done by women, and so making sure that they have these smartphones and giving them opportunities to find ways to use them to support their families. Anyway, there's just cool stuff happening every single day that we're seeing, and it's all happening simultaneously. So.
Wow. Okay. So much we could dive into. I will look forward to a part two, hopefully sooner than later. But just to wrap up part one, because again, this is sort of an initial exposure. I wanted to have myself and those listening or watching in get an initial sort of 101 into your world. Is there anything else from just a foundational perspective for those that don't know really much about kind of what you're doing or why you're doing it? Anything else you would just add in terms of just like, hey, everybody, here's what's going on. Here's what we're doing to address it. Here's how you can help.
Yeah. So one other major core piece of infrastructure that we're trying to solve is automated payments with subscriptions. on with cryptocurrency. Sorry, automated crypto subscription payments, and we're seeing that like so many businesses have depended on in the Web 2 world, the ability to sort of set it and forget it, right? To be able to say, I love what you're doing. I want to subscribe for $20 a month. And I mean, it's huge. It's a massive industry. And so with all the innovations taking place in Web3, this is still not solved. So I've got a team of developers, and we're working on sort of bringing that in to be sort of the Web3 startup for Web3 startups. And the cool thing is what you're able to do when money is programmable is just so much more than you can do just through sort of Web 2 sort of payments with fiat, right? And so there's like so with Stripe, for instance, or any other sort of payment facilitator, you can basically, yes, we'll take care of payments for you, but marketing and growth and all that's on you, right? So go like, follow, subscribe, retweet, whatever, that's on you. But now you can hard code growth incentives into your payment facilitator, right? There are things that you can do to actually encourage, not just your growth, but the growth of all of your subscribers and your followers. So we're paying attention to a lot of the crazy incentive structures that now exist, that we've seen through things like Yuga Labs, just through the whole NFT space, through all of what's happening in DAOs and how all the incentives are working. And we're saying, the game has changed, right? When money's programmable and available on a global scale, we want to provide that core piece of infrastructure that says, okay, how can you use this in ways that were never possible before, to lead to a sustainable income for you, your family, your community, in places never before was it possible, and in ways that it was never before possible. So
that is a great tee up for our next episode. Let's make sure to do that sooner than later. Wow, so much to dive into there. Okay, last question, just where can people find you online if they're interested in supporting you or ILAD or any of your other efforts, or continuing the conversation on anything that we talked about today?
Yeah, good. So I have two Twitters, right? So I have one Twitter that was sort of devoted to me and my academic pursuits, and then I have another one that is devoted to everything I'm doing in the Web3 space. And so you can definitely follow me on both of those, which I'll include the handles in the show notes. But yeah, I would love to connect and share in this journey. We're building the future, and it's pretty cool.
This is amazing. All right, Daneil, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, a couple quick things before you go. Number one, I have a general newsletter where I write about technology and startups and health science and teaching people to code. And I write about a variety of different subjects that we talk about on this show. So if you go to wclittle.com, there you'll be able to subscribe, and you'll also be able to subscribe to particular topics. If you're just interested in one or a few of them, you'll be notified right when I publish new content in those areas. Number two, my partners and I at Proto Ventures have a portfolio company called Startup Rocket. If you go to startuprocket.com, there you'll be able to receive coaching guides and customize an operations framework for you and your team and your advisors to be on the same page in terms of what is the appropriate next step for you and your entrepreneurial journey. And finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving a review anywhere that you have listened to this podcast or watched this podcast, it would be super helpful to help those who might be interested in consuming this content as well. Thank you.